Okay, good morning. Um, it's about 7 a.m. on Sunday morning for me, so there's a good chance that you'll hear my son at some point wake up and make some noise. So I apologize if that happens. If I need to, I'll try to redo the video. I'm going to go ahead and start my timer. Try to keep these again between 10 and 15 minutes. So the purpose of this video is to go over the last three things on the syllabus as best I can. What I mean by American identity, what I mean when I talk about close reading and explication, which I'm going to use those words interchangeably, and Whitman's poems, or his strophes from his poems. And we'll talk about what that means, what a strophe is, and how all these things are going to kind of connect to one another. On Moodle, you'll see that there is a link connecting you to the poem on poetryfoundation.org. That's Whitman's deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass from his book, Leaves of Grass. The poem itself is entitled Song of Myself. And we're going to be talking about certain strophes of that as a way to sort of break down that poem into its larger whole. There's a number of sections in that one, and we could take the time to read all of it. It would take us a long time to do that. There's nothing wrong with that. We should. But it's also going to be a complicated poem. I try to pick the sections at the beginning that are going to hopefully be with language and understanding that you're going to be able to connect to the most. He's writing this, of course, at the end of the 19th century. So not only is his language going to be a lot different, but so is just his mindset, his philosophy, his understanding of how to think about things. His imagery will be a lot different as well because his worldview is just different than ours. So some of this may feel a little bit distant from you, and that's okay. Some of this is learning how to work with poems that we feel distanced from and try to understand what that distance actually means. But this allows us to talk about two specific things here. The first is what I mean when I talk about American identity. If you're following the news, right, in any way, we have always been a relatively divided nation. This is not new information for us. The context of this particular course is to say that we don't know what American identity is from the start. We probably have ideas, and we could probably even give examples of what we mean. Perhaps some of them are just things we've heard before, or just land of the free, home of the brave kind of quotes. But we're going to, obviously, because this is what we do, we're going to complicate that. And we're going to try to understand how many different kinds of identities we can work with, and what the different ways that we express those are, and what the value of that is, and then that expression. Poetry is, if anything, a kind of way to express the self, right? It's through language that the poet uses that tool. That's the tool they use to express the self. Whereas, like a musician, of course, would use music, a painter would use painting, a football player would use physical skill and intelligence on the field. Like, all these are different ways to express the self. And Whitman is, of course, very much in this world. I want to start with Whitman because he is, in many ways, a quintessential sort of the primeval American poet. There are poets before him, really, and Bradstreet's a great example of one as well, and somebody to look into. But Whitman I like because his connection to some of the divisiveness of our country is something he was directly located with. Whitman was a nurse during the Civil War, and would have seen extreme violence and a real misunderstanding of what that world and that war was supposed to be. If you've taken your American history courses at any point, I don't think that the country knew the level of violence that this would have. And Whitman was part of that. He was in the nurse's tent, and he would have been operating on young men, probably everything from boys to grown-ups, and of course no anesthesia, no sense of antiseptic. It was a lot of death, a lot of blood, and a lot of pain. So Whitman is, he is on the ground floor of the Civil War. And there's not a one-to-one correlation. Like, he saw that, so he decided to write poetry. It's not quite like that, right? And we have to be careful that we don't make those sort of assumptions. But he's in this part of the country when it's starting to truly divide itself and trying to learn its own identity. And there's a lot of history that we can go into with this, right? The sort of the puritanical understanding of controlling the world, how they believe they should tame everything, and that's like the highest way to express the power and love of God is to control nature, to just their thought processes and the way that they understood how other people operate. Um, and Whitman comes in at this point and starts writing poetry that we really haven't seen before. He's not that we haven't seen it, right? That's not fair. There were other poets who were writing similarly, but with different stylistic components. What Whitman really gives us is what we call free verse or verse libre. And what free verse basically means is that he's not following any set kind of rule, any traditional form, right? Up until this point, not every poet, but by and large, all of the English poets, all of the poets from England and the French poets, um, which were kind of where we were, as Americans, we were sort of looking at them as like, that's what culture does. They were always writing in form and they were sticking to form. We'll talk about form later, but basically it's like counting the number of syllables that you have in a line, maintaining a certain kind of rhythm, trying to really control everything that you have, using a particular rhyme schemes, and really even content. You wanted to write about certain things. And so it was very structured in this regard. And it was to show, in fact, that you had structure, you had discipline, virtue, right? These are all connected into sort of this mindset that the poetry was coming out of. And Whitman comes in and really sees that we aren't, the United States, right, which was not, of course, united, um, isn't that, right? It's not this controlled narrative. It's not this small island, right, like England, right? It's this large expanse. It's this massive space. And it isn't to be contained in these little safe stanzas and these safe little spaces. And so instead, his lines, they start going all across the page, right? He writes these long, breathless lines, and he uses imagery of nature and what we would have seen, right, is sort of untouched natural landscape. And so his physical form of the poem, and we'll look at it in perhaps this video or the next one, is going to look a lot different than anything we've seen before. Now, does this matter to you if you haven't read a bunch of like, Tennyson and Browning and some of the Chaucer, these sort of classic English poets? Maybe not, right? Maybe not. If you've ever seen any poetry, if you have any experience with poetry at all, these days there's no real set standard. You can have incredibly tight poems. You can have poems that run across the page. You can be like Rupi Kaur and mix them with visuals. So poetry has really expanded, right, in this point. But when Whitman was doing this, it was really interesting, and it was new in a lot of ways. So part of what this tells us is this is a kind of like an expression of his identity and what he thought was American identity, right? American identity didn't need to be hemmed in. It didn't make sense because that wasn't the reality that we faced as a country. So in that space, Whitman's poem will actually show us in a number of ways how he feels about the self. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the screen with you real quick so we can look at this together. So this is the 1892 version of Song of Myself, which is coming from a book. And the book that he wrote and spent most of his life revising was entitled Leaves of Grass. And it's worth looking into. That's the title of the book. And if we think about this, and then we'll look at Song of Myself in a moment, but when we think about this title of this book, Leaves of Grass, when I'm going to take a quick little detour and come back, when we close read a poem, when I talk about close reading, I'm going to use the word close reading, analysis, explication. These are all interchangeable ideas. The idea behind this is to look at the poem's construction, right? To see how it is developed, what it relies on, how it's trying to communicate to us, and then breaking those down and analyzing them a little bit more so that we can see the complexity of these concepts. And one of the ones that we really do this with, one element of poetry that we like to work with is what we call imagery. Imagery in and of itself is a relatively simple definition, okay? Imagery is something that in language appeals to the sense, right? It appeals to the senses. So thinking about our 5 major senses, right? So it basically has to do with the body, right? What I can see, what I can hear, smell, what I can taste, and what I can touch, right? These are the senses. So for instance, an image, if it's over here, right? This is imagery, and over here is something that we might call idea or abstraction. And typically when we think about poetry, we think over here, we think about abstraction and concept. And we don't really consider it as in terms of the image, like what it's showing us, what we're hearing inside of the poem. So we have to understand the image, right? And over here, abstraction is important, but it's given to us through image, okay? So an example of an abstraction would be something like love. Okay, love is an abstract idea. We can't, it doesn't actually appeal to any of our senses, but we can think of, you know, visualizations, right, that we can think about with love, right? So an image of love could be like a hug. So it's an image of love, right? We can hug something. It shows us connection. It shows us, you know, the sort of completing a circle, right? Very much this becomes an image of love. So another image of love would be like, you know, this. This is embarrassing. That's a terrible heart. I'm so sorry. I'm not going to revise that. But that becomes like when you see this, when you see a heart, right, drawn somewhere on a window or something, you automatically know to associate that with this idea of love. And why is this important? Why does this matter? After this, I'll switch over and start a different video. And this is the last point I want to make about imagery, though, in this video, is that the reason it matters is we, as a culture with our language, we don't have a one-to-one correlation with what we say and what we mean, right? And what I mean by that is very simple. The example I always give in a classroom setting is, you know, to imagine a tree. Okay, for you to sit there and imagine a tree. You're welcome to try to do that right now. I think it's a good exercise. You imagine a tree, and then I would like to go around and I would ask everybody, what kind of tree do you see? And everybody gives their tree, right? You know, the people that want to share. And they range, they always range, right? And if you took a moment to think about it, I'm sure you have a tree in your mind. Sometimes it's a tree that's connected to your, you know, like your grandparents' house. There's a tree, or a tree when you were growing up, or the one that's right outside your window, or whatever, right? It's just a tree. For me, I always, you know, it's like this tree in Silverton, Texas, which is where I grew up. It was a willow tree around 1986. It's when I think of a tree, that's my image, right? That's what I see inside of my mind. But the point is that if I were to ask you, do you know what a tree is? We would all say, yes, of course I know what a tree is. When I ask you to describe what a tree is, we're all going to describe it a little bit differently. We're not going to have the same tree. And this is a really basic image. This is a very simple noun. So imagine then if I was to say, well, you know, what is love? Right? Tell me what love is. And we're all going to have different answers for that. We just are, because there's different kinds of love, first of all. And more importantly, you're just a different kind of person than I am, culturally, generationally. Historically speaking, you're different. And the way that our lives work are a lot different. When I think of love, predominantly right now, I think of my son and my wife. That's just where I am in my life. I think of love, I think of that. But there was a time in my life when I would have thought about my dog, right? And there's a time in my life when, of course, I would have thought about my parents, or you know, my siblings, or my love of poetry. Like, it always shifts. So when I say the word love, I can't assume that you're going to know what that means. So I have to show you. I have to, and in poetry, have to show you what that looks like specifically to myself, so that when you see it, and you hear that, you'll understand when I'm saying love, I mean it in this very particular case. And when we have that specificity, we can start really thinking about, how does this tell us about the identity of our speaker? How does this tell us about the identity of ourselves? And how do we relate to this experience? So what we want to take away from this right now in this particular video is that when we read a poem, when we read it closely or explicate it, we're looking for certain elements. And we're looking for how those particular elements express the poem and give us nuance about the poem. In the next video, we'll look at a section from Song of Myself. We'll discuss the title of his book, Leaves of Grass, and we'll try to play around with what a close reading actually starts to look like. Other than that, I will see you shortly, probably.